Welcome to the Practical Enneagram. Dr Janeshree Govindasamy devotes her work to supporting people in restoring healthy partnership with the inner self. She uses the Enneagram of personality as just one form of support for that work. Although you could legitimately describe her work as being more towards the spiritual side of things, Janeshree has actually been a hands-on medical doctor for more than 20 years and is quite obviously highly practical and grounded in how she designs her programs and one-on-one work. Last year, Janeshree began running these Return to Presence online retreats. I got wind of these retreats through a share on one of the Facebook groups and was instantly drawn by the language in the flyer and the fact that the group was only for type 9s. That first program, Giants Awakening, was followed by retreats for all the other types, and she will be offering them again starting February 2022. Our conversation is a starting place for an exploration of presence, what presence is and how the Enneagram helps us to become more present. She also offers us a glimpse into her group work. I think the way that Janeshree is working with the Enneagram is very progressive, and we will see a lot more of this kind of group work being offered. Links to everything in the show notes. I hope that you enjoy. It's a wide question, but who you are and what you do in the world, and how eventually also how you came into contact with the Enneagram.
That is a wide question. And it's a question I actually still struggle to answer. So I have played a variety of roles, one being a medical professional in a hospital setting from, over 20, 25 years, I would say. I left active hospital practice about 4 years ago. And the role I'm currently playing is, I'm not sure, it's a combination of a teacher, healer, doctor, facilitator. I've seen how over the years I have jumped from one role to the other. Sometimes spending time in one and sometimes in the other. And the proportion of that changed over time. And part of the journey for me has been bringing all of those together. I was always interested in what's happening under the surface, what's happening in the reality that most people are not aware of. And the exposure to healthcare amplified that question and made it a very important thing for me to understand as best as I could, especially with health and healing. So while I was practicing medicine and doing my thing as a doctor, I was also looking at the healing components and the energetic components, and also thinking about bigger picture interactions and dynamics. And I think now I am pulled it together much more than before. If I had to describe what I'm doing now, I would say it is the medicine of presence. And that sort of shifts the whole focus to what I think is the most important component in anything, whether it's self-awareness or recovery or healing or just a willingness to enjoy life as we all should be. It comes down to the level of presence we have and the quality of that presence.
Beautiful. And I'd love to know how you arrived at that. How did that become obvious to you that presence was it in terms of healing and self-awareness?
I don't know if there was a time where I didn't know that and then I did. Maybe over time, I just became more clear on what it was I was aware of. So maybe I should start with defining a little bit about what I mean by presence.
That would be great.
So it includes being present in the moment, as in the now, but that is just a component of this bigger thing I refer to as presence. So being present is what a lot of people associate with the word presence. It's the mindfulness, it's the attention, it's the self-observation, it's the alertness to what is going on and where am I in the now. But for me, the much bigger component is presence in the sense of everybody has an energetic presence, call it an atmosphere that they generate around them. If we were weather, what kind of weather are we today? And that energetic atmosphere that we carry around with us is influencing us first and foremost because it's being generated through us. But everybody else in our environment is also exposed to that. So if people are walking around all their lives as a huge toxic tornado storm cloud full of pollution and whatnot. Yeah, it's damaging them at all levels, including the physical, which we then see in medical practice with all the variety of pathologies that can show up. It also affects the way they're thinking, the way they're able to hold emotions. It affects how they're able to connect, and it affects other people and causes either a downgrading of someone else's energy state, or ideally, if they are a warm sunshine day, an uplifting of someone else. So to be aware of, first of all, that this is happening, whether or not we know it. And then once we know that that is happening, that there is much we can do to be more responsible about the quality of that presence.
Right. It's decidedly not be here now presence that we're talking about. It's the quality of our presence, of our individual presence.
So the here and now is a part of that, absolutely, because that is within the scope. But for example, someone can be in the here and now, but really grumpy and really, really excessively reactive to things. But they're here and now. But the effect of that is quite damaging to people around them and to themselves. So to be aware of, okay, right here, right now, what is the quality of my presence? And, am I just a victim to that because life is such and I'm just reacting? Or if I have some control, how can I use that control to modify that, be more responsible, teach myself to hold higher qualities of presence? Because it benefits me, it benefits the way I get to enjoy life, how much I get to be here with life as I should be. And it also benefits everyone else I'm interacting with.
There is a community awareness aspect to this definition of presence that you're working with. Like, what's our effect on others? Well, we're going to talk about the Enneagram hopefully. I'd love to know when you came into contact with it and what that was like.
Well, again, maybe I'll start with some of my own framework around the Enneagram. In for me, what most people refer to as the Enneagram, they're speaking about the Enneagram of personality. I think when I came across the Enneagram of personality, that was probably around 8-9 years ago. I lose track now. However, I had already been exposed to, let me say, the principles, the reality of the Enneagram before that in a more kind of fundamental energetic sense. For me, the Enneagram is a system that describes the movement of energy in a living system, if I had to provide a simple explanation. And that can be linked to anything we'd like to focus on. Personality is one thing we could focus on. If we go beyond that, it's touching in on many other things that are going on anyway under the surface. So I think by the time I came across the personality version of that, I was really fascinated to see that this was being applied to personality. It felt like an additional little piece of the puzzle that I hadn't really paid attention to before, with a lot of value, and for many people as a starting point, it was great because it gave them a way to make a move from where they may have been stuck. What I've also seen, though, is for certain people, at some point, they hit a threshold if they're only working with that level. That's when you need to access other levels or the kind of the deeper Enneagrams or the wider ones. That's not limited to just the psychology and the personality space. That's possibly where I've now started framing it as the Enneagram of presence, just as a way to create a path, if that makes sense, to create a path that you don't have to take that path, but just knowing that there is more beyond this layer is very helpful. Then if you're bumping up against the edges of that and you're feeling that impulse to grow beyond, there is that kind of confidence that there is more.
So it's always, you've always, even before you came into contact with it, related to it more from the spiritual side by the sounds of it than the psychological side.
Yes, that's a good way to put it.
Curious to know, and you don't have to say what your type, whether you easily identified your type and what that experience was like. I mean, did the Enneagram of personality add anything to you personally?
Absolutely, it did. I identified as a 9, and when I did, there were many things that suddenly came into view. around not just how I was operating, because, it's always bringing you into contact with some of those autopilot settings. Initially, they're quite shocking. Really? Have I been doing that all my life? Really? And it's written and it's a textbook kind of description. It's like, oh, am I this predictable? Seriously?
Yeah.
So it is a bit humbling.
It is.
But also, I think understanding how inadvertently I was causing conflict or difficulties or even hurt to people around. I think from the Enneagram 9 perspective, one of the first real hard hit kind of blind spots that I had to face was this so-called keeping things smooth strategy was causing a lot of the conflict or the distress. It was actually putting people, creating less ease than more ease in many cases. I couldn't see that. So I do recall there were a few things that stood out in that response.
It's a really difficult thing to see. And that, of course, is the 9 doing it's the mimic of the essential quality, isn't it? I'd love to talk with you about essential qualities, because that's what was coming up in my mind when you were describing these qualities of our presence. This is really what the Enneagram also maps, isn't it? Our essential qualities. How does this fit in with your model and the way that you teach the Enneagram?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. So again, it's quality of presence. So I do like that phrase, because it also alerts somebody to the fact that we're looking at a range. And if there is a range, then part of the task for someone who's committed to self-awareness is to note, where am I in that range? What quality? Where is my gauge right now? And if I am kind of close to the range of my essence side, then the quality of my presence is very different from if I'm in the range of the very distorted side. And either way, I'm the human being that is living that life experience and emanating an energy around me. So I'm either emanating a very distorted energy or a very pure energy that's much closer to the sort of the signal of that essence quality. So with a 9, if they are, let's use the term asleep, quite on autopilot, just busy, caught up, and at the same time playing this fake peace game, what's really showing up is the distortion of the true quality, which we could refer to as peace or love, whatever it is. The closer you get to that, the less these words hold, because it just is what it is. So the fake version of that essential quality is often where people also get stuck, because often it looks good to the outside and it's good enough in the moment.
How specifically does the Enneagram framework help us to become more present? So is there a process?
It can always help. Let's start there. At the same time, it also always depends on what the starting point is for any person. And that starting point is where you're at today, because each person is also shifting, So what am I engaging with today or this year or this phase of my life? What next step am I trying to take here? For a lot of people, their next step could very well be breaking into the awareness that I am more than this busy life that I'm leading, and I am more than what my job description is and my family thinks of me. So for them, breaking through that and realizing that, wow, there are patterns here at work that describe how I'm thinking and how I'm feeling, and even physiologically how I'm responding to things that I wasn't aware of. For them, that is a major shift, and that is a step into greater presence for them. Yeah.
So that's like the original peeking beyond the veil sort of situation. That's the first entry point into being more conscious.
Yes. The people that are coming through into my space are those that have already come through some of those veils, and they can feel the readiness for, let me say, greater responsibility. There is an awareness that I've already invested in understanding myself, in correcting some of these off-balance patterns. I've done a lot of that. Now I'm breaking through into a place where words are difficult. It's more about quality of life. You need a greater paradigm to hold reality differently. And that's where now, I suppose, the Enneagram of presence, if I had to say what the end point of that is, or the goal of that kind of invitation, it would be for individuals on that threshold to be able to come into that space where it is difficult to explain things, but it's much simpler. In fact, when you get into that space, things are just what they are, and you are just who you are, and you are resonant with your essence side, but in a way that you can carry that forward with you into the everyday experience, into the everyday interactions. It's a very practical thing as well, because there are individuals who have that capacity and the world needs them to step into that. And there isn't necessarily a lot of maybe support in that space, and not support in the way of this is how you need to do it, but support in the way of here is a space and time in which you get to integrate into yourself. And then you do what purpose is supposed to come through you. You're available for that in a way that is more capacitated.
That sounds like a really profound shift in your sort of center of gravity. The process that you're describing and the way you're describing it is very reminiscent of the work that Beatrice, Chestnut and Uranio Paes are doing, their levels of awareness model. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about, is it the crux from, say, level 4 to 5 that you're speaking of here? Or can you not narrow it in that way?
I have great respect for both Bea and Uranio and the work they're doing. So they're very dear to me, both of them. That shifting from stage 3 to 4 and 4 to 5, it is possibly in that range. It is one way to think of it. I would hesitate to put it into those frameworks because, if we're looking at it from the outside in, that may help someone make sense of maybe what we're talking about. But I don't know if this is just peculiar to me, but when I open these kind of spaces, it's much more about, okay, now we're doing. Now it's doing. It's not thinking of doing or understanding what we're doing. It's the doing itself. And all of those descriptions fall away, actually.
Yeah.
And again, people will naturally move in and out of these spaces. So there is a bit of bouncing back and forth until things stabilize. But once an individual is grounded, or like you said, their center of gravity has shifted, they have a way to contact their own wisdom in themselves anyway. The guidance is coming from inside out. So those stages happen, the transition happens naturally. And if there is need for, support in any way, that's also kind of orchestrated.
I understand. You've been leading presence retreats. I'd love to know how that came to be, like how you decided to work with people in that way. Were you working prior to that with people one-on-one?
Mainly one-on-one. The first Giants Awakening program, which was for the type 9s, at some point there was a very definite directive command. I don't know, there are times when you just are pretty much informed that this is what needs to happen. That's the best way I've got to explain how things started coming together for the 9 program. There were also obviously the logical surface level things I was aware of in my exposure to Enneagram workshops and things over the years, where I did notice that, 2 things that stood out for me. One was some of the most powerful moments in these workshops were when I was chatting sort of off the record, tea breaks, lunch breaks, with other type 9s. I could also see the same happening with other types. So that stood out for me. And also the fact that when these big workshops are being run, you've got to have time for 9 different types. So there is always a limitation on how deep you can go. And on top of that, with the 9s specifically, just the fact that they need more time in general, more processing time. They need more space to take things in at multiple levels. There's many things happening all at once.
Yeah.
And the usual format did not really allow for that too much. Those were some of the surface reasons I had for that coming up, that program. The deeper reasons are more difficult to explain. It just needed to happen.
Yeah.
So the plan with that really was to bring nines into a space that was nine specific. Firstly, so that they could mirror each other, just take things in at these deeper levels, even outside of the conversations. There was information being exchanged. And to allow the whole group to move into not just more awareness, but closer into presence, so shifting their gravity. It was a phenomenal process, actually, I think for everybody, for myself included. The other types, the goal is the same, but the energy is very different.
Yeah, I can
imagine. Energy is very different. With each type sort of amplifying their own patterns, it's very helpful. And then also, if we're all moving, the group is moving in one direction toward the essence point, it does help. For the other types, the goal is still the same. It's just that the path is a little bit different. The reason why these retreats are being run, for me, it's very clear that each person comes in with a purpose. And that purpose is supported by the way they are structured, physically to energetically to spiritually. And part of that structure, part of the anatomy that we've got is the personality as well. So generally speaking, whatever their purpose is would be supported by all the templates, including the personality template. And there is often a very good reason why someone has a specific, let's call it personality template. From that point, you have access to the whole thing anyway. Right. It's just specifically from this point. It's like I'm standing on the circle south and looking north, and I can see the perspective, but I've got the whole thing available anyway, especially closer to essence. So, there is the dynamics of energy that is happening, but there's nothing missing from each point. Each point is whole and complete in itself. Maybe that's a better way to put it. And from each point, you can really connect to what we're referring to as the essence of that point. And me as a human being with that template, I can connect with the essence as that flows through me, which would be individual to me. So that pure aspect of love that's available in that kind of territory flows through me as an individual. But because I've lived the life I've lived, that then gets even more specific in how it's being expressed in the world. So from there, it's also now almost irrelevant whether that's type specific or whether it's speaking to the unity essence, all is one essence. It's not a state that most people can hold anyway for too long.
Are you informed by the instinctual aspect of the Enneagram when you're working in this way?
Not too much. I suppose because of the path that these retreats are following, these other things fall into context in a different kind of way than when we're looking at it from outside. So yes, they all do play a role, and it's good to have an understanding of that, especially from the surface of things. But as one moves towards the essence side and the, kind of surrenders to that energy that is whole and complete and completely balanced, with that comes a balancing of many of these things that were out of balance. So what I find is it's not a shortcut, but it's sort of like you can't fix personality from personality. You have to adjust it from a different level. And so with the instincts, if it's seriously out of balance, you can't adjust the instincts from the instinct level. You can modify to an extent, but you hit a bump at some point. It's much easier to just move the center of gravity, and that pulls things into a different orbit. Then it's much easier if somebody kind of goes back to the old settings to recognize it and say, okay, now I can see my self-presence acting up, and, I've already suppressed this one. But there's a point of relativity. So I find it's much easier to leave all that aside, reconnect somewhere here. Yeah. And then, when people go out again to these levels, they can deal with it from a different source point.
Yeah, makes sense. Quite a different approach to most ways of teaching and working with the Enneagram, because there is I think it's true to say, mostly a preoccupation with learning the losses of presence, so the passion and the fixation, we call them, I guess, sort of contractions. And certainly that's where all of my learning has been looking at, well, what's wrong with all of the types?
Yes. So maybe one of the things that influenced me over the years is just my exposure to life and people, but maybe medicine as well, and how that is practiced. It's very much the same thing. There is this habit or tendency to look at the pathology. However, if what I've seen in practice, yes, do understand the pathology. However, any healer, whether it's in the medical professional side or alternative, or in any healer would know that at the end of the day, the healing happens outside of that doctor's intervention, outside of any treatment. What we're really doing is trying to help that patient get out of the way of the healing process. And what we're doing, if there is any intervention, is creating a support so that the healing process can happen underneath. It's the body and that life force intelligence that knows what to do there. So I may know a lot about wound care, for example. Burn injury was one of the things that I worked a lot with. So, but it's the same thing with personality and with every other layer of our anatomy. If there is something out of balance, knowing what is out of balance, there is a role for that. But really, when it comes down to bringing the system back into balance, that is, how do you surrender to the thing that knows what to do? That pure life force, call it what we will, that runs through our system. It's a habit we've learned in society to try and understand, and then hopefully we can fix it. I find understanding it is actually more about soothing and anxiety than anything else. And a lot of people are, whether they know it or not, they're hiding behind the quest to understand. Yeah. Because if your goal is to understand, it also keeps you so busy that you never get around to doing. So the thing that you're trying to understand so that you can become and you can effect these changes in yourself, you never get around to actually affecting the change. But now you know all about it. It's like looking at the ocean and it's like, okay, I can describe this. I've got the textbooks. I know the tides. I can, got the measurements for the temperature. I can see the weather patterns. And the goal was to take a swim. And, 10 years have gone by and you've got all the data and you can tell everyone else when it's safe to swim and when it's not, but you've not yet been in the water. For me, it's like, okay, guys, time to get in the water. It's time to do this. It's time to become the thing that you were thinking of becoming. And then you can go back and admire and appreciate, the logic and the intellectual insights that we've got. But it's a way to amplify the being, the change that has already happened.
I like that, amplify the being. Can you say, I noticed on your website, and I don't know how integral this is to your work, but your HeartMath stuff.
Yes.
I actually don't know too much about that, but I would love to know if that informs your work and how it does.
It is quite important in the same way as the Enneagram of personality is. I think it's a lovely bridge between the surface, kind of more tangible space where most people are comfortable, to bring them into a space where things are more difficult to explain and speak to. So the more essence present side of things. So HeartMath is a very well established and backed with a lot of groundbreaking research as well on the role of the heart in generating our energy fields. Depending on what state we're in, they refer to it as coherence. So you can either be coherent or non-coherent. There's different grades to that. But generally, if you're coherent, there's a very different energy field being generated. Another way to understand presence. So they're also using technology that can actually, you can see your heart rate and your heart rate variability patterns plotted out. And you can see the change in the pattern if you are shifting your state to one is negative compared to one that is positive. It becomes very real then. It's no longer just an abstract idea. It's like, oh, okay, I just thought of so-and-so that had me really upset. And there goes my heart. Like, look at that. It's crazy. And now I'm thinking of my, newborn child and the love that was in that space, and look at that pattern. Very, very different. Yes. So it's a way to translate in a tangible way the fact that this energy we're talking about is actually real and it's influencing us physiologically as well as this electromagnetic field that is being generated. So it comes into the very first steps in helping people understand that what we're speaking about is real, it's tangible, it has a real effect. So now that you know that, let's get on with it.
Is there like a baseline presence practice that you teach people?
What do you mean by baseline?
Is there a way that you teach people how to relax and be in essence, or to practice presence? And I'm asking that because in the coaching work that I do, it's always my least favorite part, actually, the part where I create a practice for someone and I write up the practice and maybe that's as a type 4 personality. I see it as potentially a manifestation of that quieter body center and the action the action side of things being just a little bit more challenging for me. And so I'm always curious to hear about practices. And is there a go-to or a simple presence practice that you have them do, or not really?
It's a very good question. And I usually find that each person and each group determines what needs to happen and the sequence of events as they come in at different levels, and the energy they bring is specific, so it's dealt with specifically. However, maybe the thing that pops up, and I don't know if this is speaking to your question directly, I find one of the things I always need to do very early in the process is re-embody people. If that doesn't happen, or the process doesn't begin with that coming into clearer focus, nothing else stays. To bring people back into their body in a way that they have an anchoring in the physical world, and in a way that they can recognize, or at least start getting a sense that the physical domain that we think of as our body and the physiology and all of that is only part of the spectrum of energy that we are. And it is as spiritual and as magnificent as all the other areas. So many people are so focused on getting wherever it is they think they want to get to. They neglect the physical. I mean, you don't have to look any further than what's going on in the physical body to be completely awestruck by the magnificence of life. I mean, it's just breathtaking. It's right here. You just have to feel your heart beating, and that could sweep you away. And yet people are going so far out of themselves to look. So even the expansion of self-awareness, even the expansion of one's energy state into, call it broader, higher frequencies, it needs an anchoring point while we are human beings. And that anchoring point is the physical realm.
And how do we do that? Is that just through a simple sensing practice, or do you just teach, as you just did there, just teach that's a propensity we all have to skip over that?
That depends on who it is and what stage they're at, what their personal relationship is with their body. Quite often, just the awareness of it, like we've discussed now, is enough to bring someone closer. And very naturally, then they kind of come back in, and then they can ground from there, and then we move out again. So it's usually a repetitive thing as well. And it's another reason I like to work in long periods of time. If I've got a week, then we can touch these things again and again, integrate a little bit more. Practice of presence for me applies to me as well. So often that means that I need to show up in the moment and let the moment reveal what it needs to, even in these processes. So I never really know in advance, although I do have the terrain mapped out and I know where we're moving toward, but how we're getting there, the specifics, will only be revealed in the moment. And to be available for that is one of the, the gifts. Maybe it's such a privilege when I can be there with people in that way. So I've gone off into a different track here.
No, not at all, actually. So you're just making it clear that it's not one size fits all sort of practice situation, and you're being led by your own presence, and which is an unfolding in the process. Sounds very creative I suppose in the larger sense of the word, and there's something truly creative happening in those spaces.
That's a good description. Always feels like that.
Is there anything we didn't cover or that's important to mention, either about Enneagram presence and these retreats?
So, well, the program for next year, I will release that and give you that information. So it will start from February, I think. So there'll be a number of that. But the thing that comes up, I mentioned it briefly earlier, I do tend to work in longer periods with the groups, as well as with the one-on-one work. So usually there is a clear understanding that we're working over a few weeks or longer. And with the groups, these little deep dives into the return to presence are ideally a week. The 9s are a different story. They need the 9 months to the year. So that's a bit different. But there's a reason for that. And I think it's one of the things which initially, people come across the idea of taking a week for themselves. And it's like, I can't afford that time. And yet at the same time, if it's imperative that they're ready for a shift and that shift needs to be facilitated and supported, there's very few other ways that is as effective as creating a kind of safe, secluded bubble of time. Because if you do that, you can get through 10 weeks of work in 1 week, because there isn't the need to come into a space, go back and deal with everyday life, come in and go back. Then there's only so much that can be done. It's if I'm working with somebody and I know that in an hour they've got to go pick up kids from school, I'm not going to take them down those deeper levels because it's not safe for them to go back out in the world in that condition. And plus, that doesn't get to settle, integrate, and then take the next step, which may be even a little deeper. For me, these are really transformative opportunities where you come in almost as if you were being admitted and allow the interventions to come in, allow the recovery time, allow the support that can only come from that kind of space. And you leave safely as well. So yes, just something that's just a little bit about the setup of these retreats and why we are taking time. But to take the time is actually, it's time efficiency. If you're going to do it properly. This is for me is kind of the force behind that. Don't waste your time. Don't waste everyone else's time. If you recognize the need, stop, hit the red button in the treadmill, go in, do it properly.
I think it's a good way to, without being unkind about it, filter out people whose commitment is not quite where it needs to be for that to happen.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for this and for your time.
It's a pleasure, Lizanne.
My next guest is Kundalini Yoga and Enneagram instructor Lynn Rouleau. Don't forget to subscribe and rate the podcast. Please leave a review of the podcast if you're enjoying it.